The dashcam is rolling, capturing both audio and video from Christina Spicuzza's silver Nissan Sentra as she drives through the streets of Pennsylvania. Her passenger sits quietly in the back seat, a 22-year-old dressed in dark clothing with a hood pulled over his head. The ride is almost over, and it's just a few more blocks until they reach the drop-off location. Then everything changes in an instant. He leans forward from the back seat, grabs Christina's hair with his left hand, and presses a cold metal gun against the back of her head. Christina's voice breaks immediately with pure terror. She begs him to let her go, her words tumbling out in panic, but he tells her to complete the trip, his voice unnervingly calm and controlled. She tells him that she has 4 kids and pleads desperately for him to understand that she's a mother with children who need her and she has a family waiting at home. But he responds coldly that he has a family too and orders her to keep driving. Christina begs him to take the gun off her neck, but he doesn't move it. Instead, he reaches forward, grabs her phone from the dashboard, and then snatches the dashcam itself from its mount. The video goes dark, but the audio continues recording for a few more seconds. Christina's voice can be heard shaking and breaking as she begs, asking what he wants and promising she'll cooperate if he just doesn't hurt her. Then the recording ends. That was 9:34 p.m. on February 10th, 2022. 50 minutes later, Christina Spicuzza will be dead, a single bullet in the back of her head, execution style, and her body left face down in the woods off Rosecrest Drive in Monroeville, Pennsylvania. The man who killed her is Calvin Crew. He's a 22-year-old with an outstanding warrant and a criminal record who was carrying a gun illegally, but Uber didn't know any of that because Uber doesn't run background checks on passengers. Christina was a mother of 4 who'd been driving for Uber for about a year, and February 10th, 2022 was supposed to be just another shift, but it was her last. Here's what makes this case particularly haunting, and what should make every rideshare driver think twice about the strangers they pick up. Christina Spicuzza did everything right to protect herself while working as an Uber driver. She had a dash cam installed in her car specifically for safety purposes. She checked in with her fiancé every single hour without fail, and she was careful and cautious about the inherent risks that came with picking up complete strangers. But none of that mattered on February 10th, 2022. Because the man sitting in her back seat that night wasn't just another random passenger looking for a ride home. Calvin Crew had an outstanding warrant for his arrest, a criminal history that included multiple felonies, and he was illegally carrying a loaded 9mm handgun that belonged to his girlfriend. Uber had no way of knowing any of this. There was no background check required for passengers, no verification system to screen out dangerous individuals, and no way for Christina to know that the person she was picking up posed a serious threat to her safety. The app just told her where to go and who to pick up, and she trusted the system to keep her safe. But it didn't. For 50 agonizing minutes, Calvin Crew held Christina at gunpoint while forcing her to drive through multiple neighborhoods as he desperately tried to rob her by attempting to access her banking apps and payment apps in search of anything that would get him money for what he needed. When he couldn't get what he wanted and Christina had nothing left to give him, Calvin Crew marched her into the woods and shot her once in the back of the head, execution style, then left her body face down in the dirt and drove her car back to his neighborhood like nothing had happened. Christina's fiancé Brandon wouldn't hear from her for almost 24 hours, and her 4 children wouldn't see their mother again. And all of it was captured on that dash cam footage with every word, every plea, and every moment of terror recorded before the camera went dark. Christina Spicuzza, known affectionately as Christy to everyone who loved her, was 38 years old in February 2022 and lived in Turtle Creek, Pennsylvania, a small borough outside Pittsburgh. She was a mother first and foremost with 4 children who depended on her: Andrea, Drew, Scotty, and Tori. Anyone who knew Christy knew that her smile could light up every room she was in. That's what people said about her later, and they meant it because no matter what was going on in her life, Christy was always smiling, always positive, and always loving. She had that kind of energy that made people feel better just by being around her. Her family mattered to her. Her children were her world. Christy had been with her fiancé Brandon Marto for several years by 2022, though their relationship hadn't always been easy. Brandon would later admit that their first 4 years together were rocky, because he described himself during that time as an alcoholic who was half lost and quite out of control. But Christy saw something in him that he couldn't see in himself. She was patient with him and showed him another way to live, a different path forward, and Brandon eventually got sober, got his life together, and credits Christy entirely for that transformation. He said he wanted to spend the rest of his life making up for those difficult first 4 years. That's who Christy was, someone who believed in people, someone who gave second chances, and someone who saw the good in others even when they couldn't see it themselves. By early 2022, Christy needed to find ways to support her family because being a mother with 4 kids isn't cheap. So Christy became an Uber driver, and she'd been doing it for about a year. The flexibility worked well for her schedule because she could drive when the kids were at school or after they went to bed, and she could pick up rides when she had time and take breaks when she needed to be home. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills, and Christy took safety seriously. She installed a dash cam in her car that recorded both the front and back seats with audio and video because she wanted evidence if anything ever went wrong. She also had a system with Brandon where she checked in with him every single hour while she was driving, every hour without exception. If he didn't hear from her, he knew something was wrong. It was their safety protocol and their way of making sure she was okay out there picking up strangers. On February 10th, 2022, Christy started her shift around 9 in the evening because evening rides tended to pay better with people going out to bars, restaurants, and coming home from work, so it was a good time to be on the road. At 9:11 p.m., Christy accepted a ride request with the pickup location in Pitcairn, Pennsylvania, and the drop-off in Penn Hills. Not a long ride, maybe 15 minutes at most, just a simple fare. The account requesting the ride was registered to someone named Tanaya, and when Christy pulled up to the pickup location and the passenger got in, she turned around and asked if he was there for Tanaya. He didn't respond and just got in the back seat and sat down. That passenger was Calvin Crew. He was 22 years old, and in less than 2 hours, Christina Spicuzza would be dead. Calvin Anthony Crew was 22 years old in February 2022 and lived in the Penn Hills and Pitcairn area of Pennsylvania, bouncing between addresses and staying with his girlfriend Tanaya Mullen most of the time. Calvin had a significant criminal history for someone so young, with his record including multiple felony convictions that painted a picture of someone who'd been in and out of the justice system for years and someone who hadn't learned from previous encounters with law enforcement. On February 10, 2022, Calvin had an outstanding warrant, which meant he was wanted by police, and if officers had stopped him that night for any reason and run his name, he would have been arrested immediately. He was also illegally carrying a firearm that didn't belong to him because the gun belonged to his girlfriend Tanaya Mullen, who'd purchased a 9mm handgun the previous summer. At some point, the gun disappeared from the top drawer where she kept it because Calvin had taken it without her knowledge or permission. As a convicted felon with an outstanding warrant, Calvin wasn't legally allowed to possess any firearm, but that didn't stop him from carrying it that night. Calvin's defense attorneys would later describe his background in an attempt to explain, if not excuse, what he did by saying he lived a childhood surrounded by violence and neglect. They said he was intellectually and socially challenged, while another assessment put his IQ even lower at 79 and noted he'd been diagnosed with ADHD. None of that changes what happened, but it provides context for who Calvin Crew was. On the evening of February 10th, Calvin needed money, and he needed gas money specifically because he'd been texting back and forth with Tanaya about it. She'd told him to be careful whatever he was doing that night, and he'd responded that he was trying to send someone money so he could get gas. But Calvin didn't have money, and he didn't have a job. He had a criminal record, an outstanding warrant, and a stolen gun. So Calvin came up with a plan where he asked Tanaya to order him an Uber ride with the pickup location at Britton Road in Pitcairn, where he was staying, and the drop-off location at Pershing Street in Penn Hills. Tanaya ordered the ride through her Uber account, and she had no idea what Calvin was planning. She thought she was just helping her boyfriend get somewhere, and she didn't know he was carrying her stolen gun or that he was about to commit armed robbery and murder. When the Uber arrived at 9:11 p.m., Calvin got in without saying much. The driver, Christina Spicuzza, turned around and asked if he was there for Tanaya, but Calvin didn't answer and just sat in the back seat and waited. Christina was his very first passenger ride of the night, and if Calvin had requested an Uber just 15 minutes later, he would have gotten a different driver. Someone else would have picked him up, and Christina would have moved on to her next fare and gone home to Brandon and her 4 kids at the end of her shift. But timing put Christina Spicuzza and Calvin Crew together in that car, and Calvin had already decided what he was going to do. He was going to rob whoever picked him up and get money however he could, and if that meant putting a gun to someone's head, forcing them to drive around while he tried to access their bank accounts, then that's what Calvin Crew was willing to do. The ride begins at 9:11 p.m. on February 10, 2022, as Christina drives from the pickup location in Pitcairn toward the drop-off destination in Penn Hills. It's supposed to be a routine 15-minute trip, and Calvin sits in the back seat in silence, while Christina probably assumes he's just tired or not in the mood to chat, because some passengers talk and some don't, and she's used to both. The drive progresses normally for the first 19 minutes, with no conversation, no problems, and just a standard Uber ride moving through the neighborhoods of Pennsylvania on a Thursday night. At 9:30 p.m., Christina's Uber app announces that they're approaching the drop-off location, and the automated voice says the destination for Tanaya. Time for Calvin to get out, time for Christina to complete the trip and move on to the next fare. But Calvin doesn't move to exit the vehicle. Instead, he leans forward from the back seat, grabs Christina's hair with one hand, and produces a 9mm handgun with the other hand before pressing it against the back of her head. Christina's entire body tenses, and the dash cam mounted on her windshield captures everything with video of Calvin leaning forward and audio of what happens next. Calvin orders Christina to complete the trip, and his voice is calm and controlled. Christina's voice breaks immediately as she begs Calvin to let her go, her words tumbling out fast and desperate. She tells him she has a family and says she has 4 kids who need her, pleading with him to understand that she's a mother and people are depending on her and she can't die tonight. Calvin responds that he has a family too before telling her to drive. Christina continues begging and asks him repeatedly to take the gun off her neck, to please put it down, to please let her go. She promises she won't tell anyone and she just wants to go home to her children. Calvin doesn't remove the gun. Instead, he reaches forward with his free hand and grabs Christina's cell phone from the dashboard where it's mounted, then grabs the dash cam itself and pulls it from its position. The video goes dark at 9:34 p.m., but the audio continues recording for a few more seconds. Christina's voice can be heard in the background, shaking and breaking as she continues begging, asking Calvin what he wants and promising she'll cooperate if he just doesn't hurt her. Then the recording ends completely because Calvin has turned off the camera or removed the memory card. For the next 50 minutes, Christina Spicuzza is trapped in her own car with a gun pointed at her head, while Calvin Crew forces her to drive through multiple neighborhoods. He's holding her phone now and scrolling through it, trying to figure out how to get money from her. He attempts to access her banking apps, her Venmo, her Cash App, and any payment or financial application he can find because he's trying to transfer money to himself or withdraw cash. During this time, Calvin and his girlfriend Tanaya are texting back and forth, and he's updating her on what he's doing, though the messages are vague. Around 10:27 p.m., Tanaya FaceTimes Calvin and asks when he'll be home, and he answers the call from inside Christina's car, though Tanaya has no idea that Calvin is currently holding an Uber driver at gunpoint. Calvin calls Tanaya several more times after midnight from their front porch because he's locked out of the house, and Tanaya eventually returns home and lets him in around 1:30 a.m. But between 9:30 p.m. and approximately 10:20 p.m., Calvin is still with Christina, still holding that gun, and still trying to figure out how to rob her. Eventually, Calvin realizes he's not getting any money because Christina doesn't have cash, he can't access her bank accounts, and she's a single mother driving for Uber to pay bills, so she's not carrying thousands of dollars and she doesn't have wealth to steal. So Calvin makes a decision where he can't let Christina go because she's seen his face, the dash cam recorded him before he grabbed it, and she knows what he looks like, which means she can identify him to police. Calvin orders Christina to drive to Monroeville, to a residential area near Rosecrest Drive, and it's a neighborhood with houses, but there are wooded areas nearby, places where you could hide something. Christina drives where he tells her to drive because she has no choice, with the gun still pointed at her head, and she's still hoping somehow she'll survive this. Maybe he just wants to scare her. Maybe he'll take the car and leave her there. Maybe she'll get to see her kids again. Calvin forces Christina to pull over near the 500 block of Rosecrest Drive, where there's a wooded area just off the road, dark and isolated, with no witnesses. He orders Christina out of the car and she gets out while still begging and still pleading. Calvin marches her into the woods with the gun trained on her the entire time. They walk a short distance into the trees until they're far enough from the road that no one will see them, and Calvin positions Christina so her back is to him. Then he raises the 9mm handgun and shoots Christina once in the back left side of her head. The bullet enters her skull and kills her almost instantly. Christina collapses face down onto the ground, and she never had a chance to run or fight back. Calvin stands over Christina's body for a moment before turning and walking back to her car. He gets in the driver's seat, starts the engine, and drives away while leaving Christina's body in the woods. He drives her silver Nissan Sentra back toward Pitcairn, toward the area where he lives, because he needs to get rid of the car since eventually someone will report it missing. Calvin parks Christina's car on the 500 block of 4th Street in Pitcairn, just a few blocks from where he was staying, and surveillance cameras in the area capture a lone individual exiting the vehicle and walking away. That person is Calvin Crew. He takes Christina's cell phone with him and disposes of it somewhere between Monroeville and Pitcairn, and he also gets rid of the dash cam because he knows both devices could contain evidence linking him to the murder. Then Calvin goes home and lets himself into the house where Tanaya is sleeping. He goes to bed like nothing happened. Christina Spicuzza is lying dead in the woods. Her fiancé Brandon is at home waiting for her hourly check-in that will never come. Her 4 children are asleep and unaware that their mother isn't coming home. And Calvin Crew thinks he's gotten away with murder. February 11th, 2022. That evening, before Christina left for her Uber shift, Brandon Mardo had walked her to the garage, cleaned her car windows, and they prayed together before she drove off. They last spoke at 8:59 p.m. when she told him she was picking up a passenger in Pitcairn. By 1 a.m., Christina still wasn't home and Brandon's worry began to set in because she always checks in every single hour without exception, and it's their system for how he knows she's safe. It had been over 4 hours since he'd heard from her. Brandon tries calling Christina, but her phone goes straight to voicemail, so he calls again, and then again, but nothing. He texts her, no response. By 4 a.m., Brandon's concern has turned to full panic because something is very wrong. Christina would never go this long without contacting him. She wouldn't disappear without explanation, and she wouldn't leave her kids wondering where she is. Brandon calls 911 and reports Christina missing while explaining that she was driving for Uber last night, that she picked up a passenger around 9 in the evening, and that he hasn't heard from her in over 7 hours. He checks hospitals, he checks morgues. He tells police this is completely out of character for her because she always checks in, always. Brandon also posts frantically to Facebook and asks for help finding Christina. He writes that he's holding out hope that Christy will be home soon, but he's terrified because he knows something isn't right. He explains to friends and followers that Christina always checks in with him every hour, every single hour without fail, and now it's been close to 24 hours with no word from her. He knows that if everything was okay, he would have heard from her by now. Police begin investigating immediately and contact Uber to get information about Christina's last known fare. Uber provides records showing that a ride was requested from an account belonging to Tanaya Mullen, with the pickup in Pitcairn and the drop-off supposed to be in Penn Hills. Detectives locate Christina's silver Nissan Sentra on the 500 block of 4th Street in Pitcairn, where the car is parked on the street with the doors unlocked and Christina's purse still inside. but the dash cam is missing from the windshield. This immediately raises red flags because Christina wouldn't abandon her car with her purse inside, and she wouldn't remove her dash cam, which means someone else drove her car here. Investigators begin pulling surveillance video from the area because they need to see who parked Christina's car and walked away. And they also start analyzing license plate reader data to track the movements of Christina's vehicle throughout the previous night. Meanwhile, detectives are looking for Christina herself because they don't know yet if she's injured, hiding, being held somewhere, or worse. They're operating on the assumption that time matters, and if Christina is still alive somewhere, they need to find her quickly. On February 12th, just after noon on Saturday, a call comes into police where someone has found a body in the woods near the 500 block of Rosecrest Drive in Monroeville. Officers respond to the scene and make their way into the wooded area where they find the body of a woman lying face down on the ground. She's wearing a COVID-19 face mask, and behind her body, investigators find a single 9mm bullet casing. One of the first officers on scene is Officer Francis Speranza, and his body camera is recording as he approaches the remains. He looks at the woman's body and says to another officer present that he hopes that's not the missing woman from Pitcairn, but it looks like her. It is her. The body is Christina Spicuzza. An autopsy is performed to determine cause of death, and the medical examiner finds that Christina died from a single gunshot wound that entered her head on the back left side. The manner of death is ruled a homicide, and this was an execution. Now detectives know they're investigating a murder, and they need to identify who Christina picked up that night. They need to find out who ordered that Uber ride under Tanaya Mullen's account. Investigators locate the dashcam about 1/10 of a mile from where Christina picked up her passenger because someone tossed it out along the route. The camera is recovered and brought back to the police station where the mini memory card is still inside. Detectives view the dashcam footage, and what they see confirms their worst fears. The video shows a young man getting into Christina's car, the ride proceeding normally. And then at 9:30 p.m., it shows the man leaning forward, grabbing Christina's hair, and pressing a gun to the back of her head. The audio is even more damning, with Christina's voice begging for her life, the man's voice ordering her to drive, her pleas about having 4 kids, his cold response that he has a family too, the moment he grabs her phone, and the moment he grabs the camera itself. The footage ends at 9:34 p.m., but it's enough. Detectives now have video evidence of the kidnapping, and they have the suspect's face on camera, so they just need to identify him. Detectives contact Tanaya Mullen, whose account was used to order the ride, and on February 14th, Tanaya comes to the Penn Hills police station for questioning. Her boyfriend, Calvin Crew, comes with her. When they arrive, police arrest Calvin Crew on his outstanding warrant, and he's booked and held for questioning. During the interview, Tanaya tells detectives that she ordered an Uber for Calvin on February 10th because he needed a ride. She says she'd purchased a 9mm pistol over the summer, but it disappeared from the top drawer where she kept it, and she didn't report it stolen, but just noticed it was gone. Calvin tells police a story that immediately falls apart under scrutiny, where he claims that when his Uber trip with Christina ended, he got out of the vehicle and later took a bus home to Pitcairn. But surveillance video shows Calvin never got on or off any bus that night. Detectives have the dashcam footage. They have surveillance showing Calvin exiting Christina's car on 4th Street. They have cell phone GPS records tracking his movements. They have the bullet casing from the scene, and they have Tanaya's missing gun, matching the caliber that killed Christina. They have everything they need. On February 17th, 2022, just before 7 in the evening, detectives obtain an arrest warrant for Calvin Crew. He's taken into custody in Penn Hills and charged with homicide, robbery while inflicting serious bodily injury, robbery of a motor vehicle, carrying a firearm without a license, possession of a firearm as a delinquent, and tampering with physical evidence, with kidnapping charges and additional gun charges added later. At his arraignment on February 18th, a judge denies Calvin's request for bail, and he'll remain in custody until trial. Calvin Crew is 22 years old. He murdered Christina Spicuzza for gas money. Initially, Allegheny County District Attorney Stephen Zappala announces on April 29th 2022, that his office intends to seek the death penalty against Calvin Crew because the brutality of the crime, the premeditation shown by bringing a gun and forcing Christina to drive for 50 minutes before killing her, and the fact that this was an execution-style murder all support a death penalty prosecution. But Christina's family makes a decision where they ask prosecutors not to seek the death penalty. They want Calvin to spend the rest of his life in prison, but they don't want to go through years of death penalty appeals, and they don't want to relive Christina's murder over and over again in courtroom after courtroom for decades. Days before the trial begins in early 2025, prosecutors announce they will no longer be seeking the death penalty, and instead, they'll ask for life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial begins on February 3, 2025, nearly 3 years after Christina's murder, and the courtroom is packed with Christina's family, supporters, media, and observers. The prosecution's case is straightforward and devastating, as they present the evidence methodically while building an overwhelming case against Calvin Crew. One of the first witnesses is Brandon Marto, Christina's fiancé, who testifies about their relationship, about Christina's system of checking in every single hour while she drove for Uber, and about the panic he felt when she didn't come home and didn't respond to his calls. His testimony establishes who Christina was as a loving mother and partner who was careful about safety and would never just disappear. Officer Francis Speranza takes the stand as one of the first officers on the scene where Christina's body was found in the woods off Rosecrest Drive. His body camera video is played for the jury, and the footage shows him approaching the remains and commenting to another officer that he hopes it's not the missing woman from Pitcairn, but it looks like her. The jury watches as officers document the crime scene with Christina lying face down and a bullet casing behind her body. Detective William Herman testifies about his role in the investigation and explains how he gathered video evidence from multiple locations to track Christina's car movements that night. He shows the jury surveillance footage of Christina's car being parked on 4th Street in Pitcairn, followed by a lone individual stepping out and walking away, and the prosecution argues that person is Calvin Crew. Then comes perhaps the most damaging evidence, which is the dashcam footage. The jury watches and listens as Christina picks up Calvin, as the ride proceeds normally, and as Calvin suddenly produces a gun and grabs Christina's hair. They hear Christina's voice begging for her life. They hear her tell Calvin she has 4 kids. They hear his cold response that he has a family too. They hear her plead with him to take the gun off her neck. And they hear the moment he grabs her phone and the camera itself before the footage goes dark. The courtroom is silent except for the sound of Christina's voice on that recording, and some jurors are visibly emotional while Christina's family members are crying. Tanaya Mullen testifies as well and explains that she ordered the Uber ride for Calvin using her account. She describes receiving FaceTime calls from Calvin later that night, including one where he was clearly sitting in a car, and she tells the jury about her 9mm pistol that disappeared from the top drawer of their home. The prosecution presents all 422 individual exhibits to the jury, including cell phone records, GPS data, license plate reader information, surveillance footage, the bullet casing, and fingerprint evidence from inside Christina's car. Every piece of physical evidence ties Calvin Crew to Christina's kidnapping and murder. The defense attorney, Andrew Howard, doesn't try to argue that Calvin didn't kill Christina because the evidence is too overwhelming. Instead, he argues that the jury should find Calvin guilty of second-degree murder rather than first-degree murder by claiming there's no proof of intent, and this was a murder committed during the commission of another felony like robbery or kidnapping, which would make it second-degree under Pennsylvania law. Howard also makes controversial statements suggesting that District Attorney Zappala is using the case to score political points and that the prosecution has racial undertones. These arguments anger the prosecution and many observers who see them as desperate attempts to deflect from the overwhelming evidence of Calvin's guilt. The defense presents Calvin's background with his troubled childhood, surrounded by violence and neglect, his intellectual limitations with an IQ measured between 79 and 84, and his ADHD diagnosis. The argument is that Calvin didn't have the capacity for the kind of premeditation required for first-degree murder. But the prosecution counters effectively by pointing out that Calvin brought a gun with him. He waited until the ride was almost over before revealing the weapon. He methodically tried to rob Christina for 50 minutes, and when he couldn't get money, he drove her to a secluded location and shot her execution style before hiding evidence and trying to create a false alibi. All of that shows planning, awareness, and intent. The jury deliberates for less than an hour. On February 10th, 2025, exactly 3 years to the day after Christina was murdered. They return with their verdict and find Calvin guilty on all charges. Calvin Cruz shows no visible reaction as the verdict is read, and the panel of 6 men and 6 women has spoken unanimously. Calvin kidnapped, robbed, and murdered Christina Spicuzza with premeditation and intent. He's guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing hearing is scheduled for May 5th, 2025, and this is when Christina's family will finally have the opportunity to speak directly about what Calvin Cruz took from them, and when the judge will decide exactly how long Calvin will spend in prison. But when the hearing begins, Calvin Cruz is not in the courtroom because he's chosen not to attend his own sentencing. His defense attorney speaks on his behalf and indicates that Calvin maintains his innocence despite the jury's verdict, and he plans to appeal the conviction and sentence. The fact that Calvin won't even face Christina's family during the sentencing angers everyone in the courtroom, but his absence doesn't stop Christina's loved ones from speaking. Cindy Spicuzza, Christina's mother, addresses the court, and her words are filled with grief and rage. She tells Calvin, even though he's not there to hear it, that he has a life to live, but Christy doesn't. And she explains that this should have been a death penalty case, in her opinion, but the family made the decision to ask for life in prison instead because they didn't want decades of appeals. Cindy describes what Calvin did as an execution and says he showed no mercy and no remorse. She calls the murder abhorrent and demands that the judge hand down the harshest sentence possible. Christina's sister submits a written statement that's read aloud in court, where she asks Judge Borkowski to show Calvin Cruz the same mercy that Calvin showed her sister, which is to say, none at all. Then Brandon Marto takes the stand as Christina's fiancé, who's been waiting 3 years for this moment, waiting to tell Calvin Cruz exactly what he took from their family. Brandon weeps as he speaks and tells the court that Christy was everything for his family. He describes how he was lost and out of control when they met while struggling with alcoholism and bad decisions, but Christina saw something in him that he couldn't see in himself. She was patient with him and showed him another way to live, a better way to be. Brandon explains that their first 4 years together were rocky because of his issues, but Christina never gave up on him and she loved him through it all. Once he got sober and turned his life around, he wanted to spend the rest of his life making up those first 4 years to her. Now he'll never get that chance. Brandon calls Calvin a coward and begs Judge Borkowski to show no mercy. He says he wants Calvin to suffer and to sit in prison for years and years, thinking about what he did. He wants Calvin to rot and burn in prison for taking Christina away from her children, from her family, and from everyone who loved her. Judge Borkowski listens to every statement because he's presided over many murder cases, but this one is particularly cruel, with a mother of 4 working a legitimate job to support her family, who was kidnapped and executed by a passenger she was supposed to trust. The judge announces the sentence as life in prison without the possibility of parole, and additionally, Calvin receives 13 to 26 years for the other charges to run consecutively. Calvin Cruz will never walk free again. He'll spend the rest of his natural life in a Pennsylvania state prison, he'll grow old behind bars, and he'll die there. District Attorney Steven Zappala releases a statement after the sentencing where he says that with the abundance of evidence in this case, he wholeheartedly supports the jury's decision to convict. He acknowledges that sadly, the verdict cannot bring Christina back or change the tragedy her family has experienced, but he hopes they're encouraged and find consolation in the justice served. Zappala also addresses the defense's controversial statements during trial about racial and political motivations by calling those accusations despicable, and unprofessional. He makes it clear that Calvin Crew was charged because a mountain of evidence led directly to him and proved he committed the crimes beyond a reasonable doubt, and the jury agreed. Race had nothing to do with it, and politics had nothing to do with it, because the evidence spoke for itself. Calvin Crew is now 26 years old, and he'll spend the rest of his life in prison because on February 10, 2022, he needed gas money and decided the easiest way to get it was to rob an Uber driver. He chose Christina Spicuzza, held her at gunpoint for 50 minutes, and when she had nothing to give him, he shot her in the back of the head and left her body in the woods like she was nothing. Christina's 4 children will grow up without knowing their mother, and Brandon will raise them alone while carrying the weight of knowing that the woman he loved, the woman who saved his life and believed in him when no one else did, died terrified and begging for mercy that never came. The family filed a civil lawsuit against Uber seeking accountability for safety failures they believed contributed to Christina's death, and while no amount of money will bring Christina back, they wanted Uber to answer for allowing passengers like Calvin Crew to use the platform without background checks, without identity verification, and without any safeguards to protect drivers from dangerous individuals. Uber responded by pointing to their safety toolkit features that include emergency buttons and ride-sharing capabilities, but critics argued these tools do nothing to prevent passengers like Calvin Crew from ordering rides in the first place. Christina Spicuzza's murder exposed a fundamental flaw in the rideshare industry, where drivers are extensively background checked, monitored, and regulated, but passengers face virtually no scrutiny at all. Anyone with a smartphone and a payment method can order a ride, and drivers have no way of knowing if they're picking up someone with a violent criminal history, an outstanding warrant, or an illegal weapon. The case sparked conversations nationwide about rideshare driver safety and led to calls for passenger background checks, mandatory identity verification at pickup, and better in-car safety features like panic buttons that directly alert police and automatically upload dashcam footage to cloud servers. But for Christina's family, none of those changes matter anymore because Christina is gone. She was 38 years old. She was a mother of 4. She was trying to make a living to support her family, and she trusted the system to keep her safe. But it didn't. Christina's story isn't just one tragedy. It's a warning, because what happened to her has happened to far too many rideshare drivers across the country. Every day, thousands of drivers pick up strangers in dark streets, isolated neighborhoods, or silent backroads, trusting an app to keep them safe. But the truth is, drivers are often completely unprotected. No background checks for passengers, no identity verification, no real-time safety monitoring, just hope. Hope that the next ride won't be the last. Christina Spicuzza did everything right. She followed the rules, worked hard, and trusted the system. But that night, she didn't make it home. And until real changes are made, every rideshare driver, every mother, father, student, or worker just trying to make a living remains vulnerable. If you've watched this far, thank you. Thank you for caring about Christina's story, and about the stories of so many others whose voices are never heard. If you want to see more cases like this, stories that expose failures, demand accountability, and honor the victims, make sure you subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.